Opening up the queen and a bishop, d4 immediately stakes a claim in the center, influencing key squares. Unbalancing the game immediately, this daring gambit weakens the kingside, but aims to disrupt white's central control and open attacking avenues. Developing the knight to c3 solidifies control of central squares, aiming to challenge black's unusual pawn advance and potentially prepare for kingside expansion. Developing the knight to its natural square, this supports potential pawn advances and prepares for castling, a solid centralizing maneuver. Pinning the knight against the queen disrupts black's early development. Challenging the center with the pawn creates a bold pawn lever, potentially opening lines and inviting confrontation immediately. Solidifying the center, this pawn advances to reinforce the d-pawn, offering a safe haven for the king and preparing for potential pawn breaks. Solidifying the pawn chain, this prepares to develop the bishop and castle, aiming for a more robust pawn structure against white's pressing initiative. Reinforcing the center's pawn chain with knights opens up more avenues for piece development, preparing to contest central influence. Securing the queenside flank with this pawn advance prevents immediate nb5 threats and prepares for future queenside expansion. Fortifying the advanced knight on e5 creates an imposing outpost, exerting pressure on black's central pawn structure and preparing for potential kingside advances. Challenging white's central control, this pawn thrust immediately opens lines and questions the knight's precarious outpost, aiming to dismantle the pawn chain and seize initiative by widening the battlefield. Unleashing a bold pawn storm, white seeks to disrupt black's queenside stability and gain immediate space, though it opens up potential weaknesses on the kingside should black find counterplay. Initiating a pawn structural confrontation, black accepts the offered material to disrupt white's central pawn chain and gain a foothold for a potentially open c file. Opening the e-file now forces a confrontation in the center, potentially liberating your pieces and creating immediate pressure on black's underdeveloped queenside. Black boldly challenges white's central pawns and aims to disrupt white's queenside structure with queen and pawn pressure, creating a complex tactical landscape where active piece play will be paramount. Suddenly, the knight leaps to the edge of the board, a bold sortie aiming to disrupt black's queen and potentially secure a permanent outpost. This aggressive pawn structure by white, while creating attacking chances, has also weakened the kingside, and this knight's maneuver now tests the fragility of black's queenside defenses and the coordination of their pieces. This check abruptly disrupts white's developing momentum, forcing a choice: block the attack and potentially weaken the king's defenses, or retreat and cede valuable central squares. The queen, now actively harassing a knight, creates immediate tactical headaches and prevents white from smoothly consolidating their pawn advances. Fortifying the queenside pawn chain with a disciplined advance of the c-pawn now establishes a solid defensive structure, anticipating potential threats along the a5-d2 diagonal. Liberating the bishop's diagonal opens lines but invites immediate counterplay. Black grasps an advanced pawn, potentially weakening their own structure for tempo, while white eyes the open files. Unlocking the f-file for your rook and queen, forcing a piece exchange that, while seemingly generous, actually disrupts black's developing harmony and opens avenues for future central pressure. The pawn structure has become a jagged mess after this recapture, creating a clear target on the kingside that will demand constant vigilance and potentially lead to a compromised defensive setup for black. Capitalizing on the loose dark-squared bishop, this knight fork reclaims material and disrupts black's pawn structure. This maneuver is crucial for re-establishing central presence and preparing for further development. Consider it a reclamation of square space after the earlier exchange, where the knight now aims to bolster the e5 pawn and control key diagonals, potentially supporting a future nb6 or n5 advance to challenge white's centralized pieces, while also offering some defense to the kingside. Instantly solidifying the knight's outpost and preparing for queenside expansion, this maneuver neatly sidesteps the immediate threat of the hanging pawn and reinforces a valuable central square. Unleashing a pawn storm to sever the king's escape routes, 13, h5 now carves a path for potential attacking pieces, directly challenging white's central pawn structure and subtly weakening the kingside defense by inviting further pawn advances. Solidifying control over the d3 square initiates a plan to contest the open files, aiming to disrupt black's potentially attacking structure, especially with the compromised kingside. Unleashing the pawn storm feels like a desperate gamble, sacrificing pawn structure for a fleeting initiative that might easily evaporate. This aggressive pawn thrust dangerously weakens your kingside, leaving it exposed to a potential onslaught. Seizing space on the queenside with this pawn advance aims to disrupt black's developing structure and potentially create avenues for a rook invasion, though it does leave the queenside slightly more open to counterplay. The queen's journey across the board, seeking safer harbors while subtly probing white's central structure, highlights black's attempt to reposition its most potent attacking piece amidst the unfolding pawn chaos. Securing the open c-file solidifies white's presence, creating immediate pressure along that central artery and aiming to disrupt black's king's safety should the position simplify. Conceding the queen's file with a pawn thrust up the queenside opens up a potential avenue for enemy pieces to infiltrate, so black should be prioritizing development and reinforcing their structure before the queenside becomes a critical weakness. Fulfilling the king's safety deficit while activating the queen's influence along the e-file presents a sensible dual-purpose maneuver, aiming to both solidify the central structure and create potential threats against black's increasingly exposed monarch. Preparing the king for its own defense, the monarch embarks on a circuitous journey to a potentially safer haven on the kingside, simultaneously reinforcing the beleaguered f5 pawn and indirectly supporting the development of the remaining pieces. A bold step toward centralization, shifting the monarch from its perilous exposure on the e-file and aiming to improve its defensive capabilities while preparing for potential future skirmishes on the kingside. Finally, black unleashes the knight from its passive post, preparing to contest the crucial central squares and potentially launch an attack on white's king, which is currently exposed and somewhat vulnerable on the queenside. Shifting the knight to a more flexible position on b2 aims to reinforce the queenside and potentially prepare a kingside pawn push later, while also defending against black's activity. Black solidifies the bishop's influence on the queenside diagonal, preparing to challenge white's central control and potentially activate the knight on d7. Challenging the center, this bold thrust aims to shatter black's pawn structure and seize initiative, potentially opening lines towards the beleaguered king. Reclaiming the initiative on the open c-file, black decisively asserts control over this crucial pathway, potentially setting the stage for future pressure against white's potentially exposed monarch, while simultaneously preparing to mobilize their remaining pieces for a more active role in the unfolding middle game drama. Concentrating the rooks behind the pawn chain now, aiming to eventually exert pressure along the c-file and potentially offer support for a future advance of the b-pawn, while also preparing to connect them for enhanced defensive capabilities and offensive potential. Black's queen aggressively occupies the f4 square, aiming to disrupt white's defensive structure and potentially target the king's wing, though it does expose itself to further threats. Striking at the center, white finally unlocks the c-file, creating immediate pressure against black's seemingly solid pawn chain and potentially exposing the d5 square for future piece incursions. The pawn grab on the bishop's diagonal immediately challenges white's central control, creating a dynamic pawn structure and forcing white to commit to further material exchanges or face a weakened king's defense. Unleashing a powerful bishop to the robust diagonal, white seeks to exploit the exposed black monarch by pinning down the crucial bishop on b4. The central tension is palpable, with white aiming to reinforce their attacking potential and control key squares. This maneuver also prepares for potential kingside advances, potentially opening lines for immediate threats. Reclaiming the central pawn structure becomes paramount, as the freed e-file now offers potential entry points for the opponent's active pieces. Unlocking the d5 pawn offers white a welcome opportunity to simplify and centralize a knight, potentially alleviating the pressure on the kingside while creating new attacking avenues through the now-open d-file. Exposing the king to a direct assault, black relinquishes control of the central dark squares, paving the way for white's pieces to infiltrate and create decisive threats around the monarch. The king's safety is compromised. Sacrificing the bishop on d5 forces a crucial decision, potentially leading to an open g-file and exposure for the black monarch. Instinctively steering the monarch towards the center, aiming for active defense. Yet this maneuver might leave the king exposed to a battery of enemy pieces along the open diagonals, creating immediate tactical concerns that require careful calculation to navigate. Shifting the queen to eavesdrop on the king's side, this maneuver prepares a potential reshuffling of white's forces, aiming to exploit the newly opened files and the slightly compromised black monarch. Unlocking the c-file for potential counterplay, this placement prepares to challenge white's entrenched bishops and potentially disrupt their control over the center. Exchanges are often the simplest way to resolve complex positions, and white's queen sacrifice here, while seemingly bold, aims to simplify into a winning pawn advantage after the sequence. The idea is that after recapturing the pawn on d5, white will have a central passed pawn and a superior pawn structure that will be very difficult for black to defend. This looks like a prudent decision to reduce black's attacking potential while capitalizing on the initiative gained. Finally clearing out that tricky bishop from its trapped position on d6, black aims to activate this piece and potentially shore up the kingside pawn structure, which has become quite porous. The immediate consequence is the exchange of queens, ushering in an endgame where black's king activity and the newfound freedom for the bishop will be paramount. Initiating development of the pinned knight offers a chance to reactivate a slumbering piece and potentially challenge black's centralized bishop on d6. Unleashing the bishop from its pawn cage, this maneuver aims to activate the piece and reposition it to a more influential square, potentially pressuring white's d3 bishop or even eyeing the queen side. Capturing the rook initiates an endgame where white aims to exploit black's weakened kingside and exposed monarch. Reclaiming the material is the immediate priority, but the repositioning of the bishop to that central square fundamentally alters the pawn structure, opening a diagonal for your queen and potentially creating attacking chances against white's exposed king. Transitioning the king forward from the center is essential now, as the open files demand active royal maneuvering to avoid being trapped. Asserting control over the open e-file, black's rook aggressively penetrates white's weakened position, forcing the king to react and potentially disrupting any nascent defensive structure white was attempting to establish after the pawn exchange. Securing the king's safety is paramount. Retreating it to the relative quiet of d2 prepares for potential pawn advances or defensive maneuvers, while also clearing the d-file for future pieces. The rook finally finds active duty on the open file, a much-needed development after white's king was forced out of its central security. Re-establishing control of the open file is paramount after that exchange, aiming to restrict black's rook and create potential weaknesses on the queen side. Capturing the rook is tempting, a sudden material gain that feels like a significant advantage, but it neglects the immediate defensive necessity of securing your king. The pawn on h2, while seemingly abandoned, was a crucial shield, and its removal opens a dangerous diagonal directly towards your monarch, creating a tactical vulnerability that your opponent's bishop can exploit with surprising swiftness. Securing the bishop to its stable outpost on the third rank now aims to restrict black's remaining active piece and potentially prepare for a more streamlined pawn advance in the center. Black aims to activate their bishop, bringing it into the central battle and potentially supporting pawn advances on the king side, or preparing to challenge white's central presence. The rook's aggressive charge to the sixth rank immediately suffocates black's counterplay, aiming to isolate the stranded bishop on b8 and exploit the precariousness of the pawn structure. Harnessing the open files for counterplay, black repositions the rook to the potent c6 square, initiating a strategic redeployment that aims to disrupt white's control and potentially create threats on the queen side or even target white's king indirectly. Restoring the rook to the central file immediately bolsters white's queenside control, contesting the open file and preparing for potential future advances or defensive maneuvers, while also preventing black from consolidating their pieces on that wing. Snatching that pawn opens a critical diagonal for your rook, aiming directly at white's vulnerable king and simultaneously relieving the pressure on your own monarch. Unleashing the king offers a sliver of hope by aiming to reactivate it and contest the newly opened diagonals, though the risk of exposure against black's active bishop remains significant. Re-establishing central influence with the rook is a sensible idea, aiming to contest the open file and potentially impede white's initiative as the material dwindles. Seizing the open diagonal, this bishop sacrifice aims to shatter black's pawn structure and expose the king's defenses, disrupting any comfortable consolidation. Spotting a tactical opportunity, black plunders an undefended pawn on the queen side, aiming to disrupt white's coordination and perhaps secure some material advantage, although it does invite white's bishop into a more active diagonal. Fostering activity on the king side, the pawn advances, creating a new avenue for potential assault. Unleashing a tactical surprise, black aims to disrupt white's pawn structure and seize central influence by offering a sacrifice that potentially opens lines for the bishop. Seeking active counterplay, white's knight lands on a central square, ready to exploit the king's exposed position and the weak pawn structure that black has created. A desperate gambit to introduce a new attacking front down the h-file, hoping to disrupt white's recently consolidated pieces and potentially stir up some chaos before the inevitable pawn storm on the queen side begins to bite. Opening a clear diagonal for the bishop, this maneuver aims to exploit the now exposed black king and the weakened pawn structure on the king side, potentially creating threats against the monarch that black will struggle to defend. This rook's repositioning aims to disrupt white's control over the open files, potentially creating escape routes for the king or preparing a counterattack on the queen side. Reasserting knight control over the center, a strategic pivot to exploit black's exposed king and potentially weak pawn structure after the exchange of queens. The rook boldly advances, seeking to exploit the open file and pin down white's vulnerable knight. Seeking a precarious outpost, the knight ventures forward, aiming to disrupt black's consolidating queen's rook pawn. Liberating the bishop to a more active diagonal creates a potent counterplay threat, eyeing the weak pawns on the queen side and forcing white to constantly defend rather than advance their own initiative. Pivoting the rook to the 8th rank unleashes a powerful positional squeeze, aiming to dislodge the knight from its comfortable outpost and initiate a decisive endgame transition where white holds a material advantage. The rook's repositioning to the 4th rank, far from the active fighting squares, signals a resigned acceptance of the positional disadvantage. The knight's repositioning on d3 aims to disrupt black's coordination and exploit the open files, potentially preparing for a central pawn push or a coordinated attack on the weakened king side. A desperate check, sacrificing a piece to disrupt white's advancing king and perhaps create a moment of confusion, though the material deficit remains overwhelming. The monarch scrambles for sanctuary, seeking refuge as the open files become increasingly precarious. A final check on the bishop's final excursion, snatching that last pawn and leaving a gaping hole in white's defense, offers a momentary satisfaction, but the position remains dire. White's king bravely steps into the fray, transforming from a passive defender into an active participant in the endgame battle. Snatching that rook instantly alters the pawn structure and opens up white's king considerably. Seizing the isolated pawn presents a significant advantage, forcing the opponent to react and potentially exposing weaknesses in their remaining structure. The pawn advance on the queen side aims to disrupt white's bishop and pawn structure, potentially opening lines for black's rook, though it creates a structural weakness. Executing a forced check now that the opponent's king is trapped in the center, this king hunt is about to conclude with a decisive material advantage. The king, now adrift in the open, must desperately seek refuge from the incoming artillery. The rook's audacious leap to the 8th rank signals an intent to disrupt black's already precarious pawn structure, and perhaps even create threats against the exposed king, leveraging the open files for aggressive action. Re-establishing the bishop to its active diagonal on the queen side, this retreat aims to regroup after white's aggressive king hunt, looking to contest central control and prepare for potential counterplay against white's still somewhat exposed monarch.